still finalizing the website, but you can read the full report if you go to the analysis tab at fragilestatesindex.org. Before we go to our speakers, I would like to give a brief overview of some of the key findings from the Fragile States Index this year, which frankly have challenged many of our assumptions about fragility and resilience. If there's one thing that 2020 taught us, it's that if we prepare for a health crisis as if it were only a health crisis, then we're gonna miss the boat. When COVID hit early last year, it quickly turned into an economic crisis. In some cases, the economic crisis exacerbated social and political tensions. In some cases, there were sharp increases in violence against women and girls. In some cases, there were increases in authoritarianism as governments struggled in many different ways to manage all these rising pressures. In other cases, radical groups capitalized on popular discontent to mobilize support for their extremist agendas. And in some cases, this all led to a vicious cycle which then further exacerbated the health crisis. We learned that when a shock hits, as important as a strong economy might be, or even a good health system or infrastructure, a necessary precondition for resilience is a stock of social capital. A country that cannot take collective action, a population that cannot make shared sacrifices, a country where there's no collective buy-in to a national strategy cannot be resilient, no matter how good the economy is, or how many doctors or ventilators you might have. That's why the Fragile States Index includes indicators like group grievance and factionalized elites, alongside indicators like public services and poverty. When a shock hits a divided population, it tends to divide it further, and you get bogged down in gridlock and brinksmanship. We saw this in the aftermath of the financial crisis in 2009, and we saw it again last year in countries all around the world. On the other hand, when a unified country, they seem to be able to pull together and isolate radical groups who would seek to sow division. But there are other patterns and trends that have been highlighted over the years that remain salient in 2020. Violent extremists and communal violence have been exacerbated by environmental pressures and mass migration, leading to regional spillover effects in places like West Africa and elsewhere. There were natural disasters in 2020 that occurred in Central America and Southeast Asia and Afghanistan and Turkey. There were bushfires in Australia, which posed many challenges to communities and governments there. As George said, often people look to the Fragile States Index to see which countries are most fragile or least fragile, or to see who worsened by the most or who improved by the most. And that's all there in the report, which you can read on our website. The most fragile this year were Somalia, Syria, and South Sudan. Least fragile were Finland, Norway, Iceland, New Zealand, and Denmark. The countries which are not the worst on the Fragile States Index, but who worsened by the most last year are the United States, Armenia, Spain, Ethiopia, and Romania. The countries who were improved by the most were Timor-Leste, Gambia, and Pakistan. To learn about the dynamics behind these trends, you can read the report, or maybe the panelists will touch on this further during the discussion. However, there are a few conclusions I would like to leave you with as we look at some of the broader patterns in the data. One is a good news story. Over the last decade, there seems to have been a gradual improvement in most countries. This corroborates the findings of researchers like Steven Pinker and Hans Rosling, who point out sharp improvements globally in indicators like poverty and mortality all over the world. But two, there also seems to be a fragility trap, as Collier, Besley, and Kahn put it in their 2018 paper, as the same countries keep showing up year after year after year at the top of the Fragile States Index. And three, just because a country is on the sustainable end of the index, it doesn't mean that they're automatically going to be more resilient in the face of an external shock, particularly if they have problems in the indicators of group grievance and factionalized elites. One final thought. According to the Fragile States Index, after a shock, it seems that there is a tendency for things to go back to normal the subsequent year. The scores all settle back down to what they were before the crisis. There's a tendency then to assume that if the economy comes back, that the problem is now behind us. But the truth is that a major global shock seems to come around about every 15 years or so. Of course, the frequency of those global shocks may change, but eventually a shock will hit. And when it does, unless countries can get their social cohesion indicators under control, they will be even more vulnerable the next time. We're very grateful to have an excellent panel of speakers today to discuss what the FSI has to say about bouncing back from crisis after a year like 2020, moderated by Liz Hume, the president and CEO of the Alliance for Peacebuilding. But first, we're going to hear from the esteemed Senator Chris Coons from Delaware and Texas Congressman Michael McCaul. Senator Coons and Congressman McCaul were both highly instrumental in the drafting and passage of the landmark Global Fragility Act. We're so grateful for their leadership, as the GFA could be a bipartisan game changer in how the United States works strategically to prevent fragility from worsening in countries around the world, taking a whole of government approach rather than reacting to crisis after it occurs. Here's Senator Coons.
Hi, I'm U.S. Senator Chris Coons from Delaware. I'd like to thank the Fund for Peace, the Alliance for Peacebuilding, and the other partners joining us today for your long-standing efforts to advocate for peace and justice around the world, and for continuing the conversation on how we can emerge from the COVID-19 crisis stronger and more resilient. The global COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated long-standing, existing, and growing challenges like weak governance, conflict and unrest, food insecurity, and migration. But the Global Fragility Act is an important new tool available to the U.S. government to help improve and reorient its approach to addressing the drivers of these challenges. I'm proud to have helped lead the drafting and enactment of the Global Fragility Act, which I undertook in an effort to better align U.S. development, diplomacy, and defense policies to help tackle fragility in nations around the world. As a member of both the Senate Foreign Relations and Appropriations Committees, I'm working hard with my congressional colleagues to promote stabilization of fragile countries, to build peace and maximize the impact of U.S. foreign assistance. Since the start of the global pandemic, we've come a long way, but we need to continue our investments in public health and hopefully a more widespread trust in science. President Biden has worked tirelessly to restore principled bipartisan U.S. leadership on the world stage. He knows that while we're still in the throes of the worst pandemic in a century and a global crisis of inequality, that a new approach is necessary. That's why we must continue to trust science, trust those with expertise in peace building and conflict resolution as well as public health, because only then we can regain credibility and lead our global partners in this essential effort. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of today's conversation. I look forward to working with all of you and with this community to address the challenges ahead.
Hello, this is Congressman Michael McCaul. Thank you for inviting me to speak at your annual lunch event. The Fragile States Index is an important data-driven tool to track trends and risk factors in state fragility. This year, as the world grapples with the destabilization caused by COVID-19, the findings of this report are particularly relevant. As the lead Republican of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, I worked firsthand to address the problems facing conflict-ridden parts of our world. But as we've seen, a piecemeal approach does not work. Weak governance, corruption, and lack of economic and educational opportunities contribute to state fragility, and community grievances are exploited by terrorist and criminal organizations. We cannot continue to allow hostile areas across the world become recruiting grounds for these terrorists and criminals. It is critical we work to prevent violent conflict before it is too late. And the Global Fragility Act does just that. With a whole-of-government approach, the U.S. must streamline our diplomatic development and defense efforts to prevent violent conflict and address the root causes of fragility. So I'm proud to work with my colleagues across the aisle to implement the Global Fragility Act. Preventing conflict isn't a Republican issue or a Democrat issue. It's an American issue. In December, I welcomed the release of the Global Fragility Strategy. The strategy was developed in close consultation with Congress and on a bipartisan basis. Now the Biden administration should use this strategy to select priority countries and regions without delay. This cannot wait. Recent terror attacks in Mozambique threaten destabilization in the country's Cabo Delgado province. Efforts to address root causes of terrorist recruitment are urgently needed. The conflict in Tigray has escalated into a crisis and threatens destabilization to the broader Horn of Africa. Delayed presidential elections in Somalia threaten to undermine progress in democratic governance and efforts to combat al-Shabaab. There is no end in sight in addressing the conflict in Yemen and Syria as the humanitarian situations continue to worsen. And a lack of economic opportunity continues to drive illegal immigration from Central America and contribute to state fragility. And as the world struggles with the impacts of COVID-19, the Global Fragility Act is a critical tool to adapt our approach to fragile states, making it easier to anticipate potential sources of conflict across the world. So I want to commend this 2021 release of the Fragile States Index. I'm confident that we will continue to work in a bipartisan manner to address threats of state fragility and terrorism abroad to save lives. And by preventing terrorism abroad, we can better protect American lives here at home. Thank you.
Thanks so much to Senator Coons and Congressman McCaul for those remarks. Now I would like to turn to Liz Hume. Liz is the president and CEO of Alliance for Peacebuilding, which has done so much to promote strategic policies like the Global Fragility Act, as well as to unite peace actors and integrate all sectors for innovation and to anchor peacebuilding as the tool of first resort in managing conflict. She'll be introducing the amazing panelists and moderating the discussion. Thanks so much, Liz.
Thank you, Nate, and thanks to the Fund for Peace for putting together the Fragile State Index and this launch today. And before I introduce the panelists, I just want to say a couple of things about the Fragile State Index. I've been working on conflict affected and fragile states for over 2 decades. And every year since the launch of the Fragile State Index, the minute it comes out, I pore over the results. It actually usually sits on my computer in an open tab. That's how much I use it. But it's not only the numbers, as George said, that matters, whether a country is 19 or number 1, but the story behind the data. And the Fragile State Index is critical for a few reasons. It's consistent in measuring the same indicators over time. And data is good, but we need to understand the story behind the data. So the Fragile State Index doesn't just give you a score, it explains why with detailed indicators, how a country is doing, going beyond the top line talking points of grievances that drive conflict. It's also open sourced and shared widely. That is critical. When I was at USAID with the Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation, we tried to put out a conflict watch list, but after a year, it had diplomatic challenges, and we had to take it back and make it sensitive but unclassified, so it could not be released. But more importantly, why is the Fragile State Index so critical? Because good data equals good policy. We used the Alliance for Peacebuilding and Mercy Corps, who co-lead the Global Fragility Act coalition. We used the Fragile State Index to make the case for the GFA. We also then used the Fragile State Index as one of the key parts in our report with One Earth Future Foundation on how to select priority countries and regions. So the Fragile State Index is so critical in terms of working with donors and policymakers, but even for those governments, within your own countries, at home and abroad, to make good decisions about programs and funding. So I urge you all I urge you all to use the Fragile State Index, use it as a tool. Again, I'm so happy to see such enthusiasm for this launch, but it's not a one-time deal. This is a tool that should be used over and over and over again. And so with that, I would like to introduce our panelists. Cindy Changong is International Alert's Regional Director for Africa. I'm not going to go into everybody's bio because you'll see them on the web page. And she's going to be talking about how the Fragile State Index and showing it how it practically relates in terms of Africa. Neelan Parker is going to be, she's the co-director of the Bridging Divides Initiative at Princeton University. And she has been doing phenomenal work on looking at the US and analyzing conflict drivers and understanding what that means practically for what we should be doing here in the United States. Marie Long Akin Olgobede, she is the Director General for the African Development Bank, and she is also going to be talking about how we've seen grievances and conflict trends in Africa. And Natalie Fritz is the Program Manager at the Fund for Peace, and I just want again to thank and congratulate Natalie and Nate and everybody else at the Fund for Peace for this incredible report and analysis. Natalie is going to be wrapping it all up for us and giving us even some more insights and data on the Fragile States Index. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Cindy to look at it from a regional context.
Thank you very much, Liz, and my thanks to the Fund for Peace for having me on this panel. Africa, unfortunately, has the unwanted distinction of having 7 of the top 10 and 14 out of the top 20 most fragile countries for 2020. And analyzing the index data and looking back at International Alert's own work in Africa, it strikes me that there's a parallel between how the COVID pandemic affected our health and how conflicts affect communities, societies, and countries. And my analogy is going to be a bit strained at times, so I ask for your forgiveness in advance. But firstly, like COVID, conflict hits the people who are already vulnerable the hardest. Across the world, we saw that the impact of the disease differed vastly among socioeconomic classes, and so it goes with conflict. For example, climate change-related impact on conflict is a dominant trend in the FSI report. And we know from our experience that poor and marginalized communities are the most affected by immediate climate catastrophes and failures of governance systems to prevent, manage, and mitigate them. The pandemic itself was another shock, and economic indicators show millions likely to be pushed further into poverty across the African continent. And it's the people that were already suffering who will bear the brunt of this pandemic. And such compounded crises can create a spiral of vulnerability, or the fragility trap that Nate referenced, which makes it difficult for people to recover from future shocks and increases grievances that make turning to violence more appealing. So just as we had to emphasize protecting the most vulnerable in societies to mitigate the worst impacts of COVID, we cannot address fragility and crises without looking at how they impact the most vulnerable people and making sure that their voices are heard and their needs are taken into account. Secondly, COVID exposed underlying health conditions as the biggest mortality risk. And similarly, every crisis exposes severe underlying conditions in societies, as both Nate and Senator Coons outlined earlier. And across the African continent, a deficit of trust and accountability between the state and citizens is a key factor in many conflicts. This dramatically worsened during the COVID-19 pandemic, but issues that were exposed, such as lack of economic and social safety nets, inability of health services to cope, security forces committing abuses to enforce lockdowns, corruption in the management of relief, these were all problems that predated the pandemic. So it's no surprise that in a country like Nigeria, insurgents, criminals, and other armed groups have successfully seized on the economic downturn and governance vacuum to escalate their attacks. Thirdly, with COVID-19, it hasn't always been possible to predict who would suffer from a mild case and who would become gravely ill. And similarly, the factors that can trigger and escalate conflict are complex. So for example, there's a long-standing perception that poverty leads to violence and economic development will bring peace. And indeed, when you look at the data, the most fragile countries in the index in general score poorly on the economy and economic inequality indicators. However, that doesn't tell the full picture, the story behind the data, as Liz stated. And indeed, the top 20 worst ranked for economy range from first in the index to 83rd overall. And for economic inequality, they range from 2nd to 78th. So it's when you cross-reference the data on economy with other indicators such as group grievances and public services that you get a more nuanced picture of the fragility risks in each context. And that's the added value of an index such as this, as George said earlier, by allowing us to analyze a broad range of factors and how different elements interact with each other to increase or reduce fragility. Fourth, as with COVID, fragility is highly contagious and does not respect national borders. So it's no surprise to see Libya and Mali both appear on the list of most worsened over the past decade. There's a clear line that can be drawn from the eruption of conflict in Libya to the Malian crisis, and now the escalation of violence in Burkina Faso. As with the pandemic, solutions to fragility cannot be found by looking only inwards and at national interests. Fifth, we've heard the talk of long COVID, people who suffer the effects well after they recover from the disease. Conflict is the same. There are long-term effects that need to be anticipated and managed, even if there are initial successes in halting violence. So for example, it's clear that climate change and particularly the governance of natural resources are going to have lasting effects well into the future. And when you look at a country like Mali, which ranks high in the index for risk on demographic pressure, group grievances, public services, refugees and IDP camps, and you consider how all of these factors intersect with access to natural resources, the case for planning long-term solutions to climate change and natural resource management is more than evident. However, the parallels between COVID and conflict are not all negative. We build up immunity when we get ill. The body can learn from its previous experience and become more effective and resilient the next time it is infected. But to do this, we must attack the virus itself. Similarly, we stand the best chance of reducing fragility and dealing with conflict sustainably when we attack the root causes and not just the symptoms. And as with disease, and as Congressman McCaul alluded to, prevention is better than cure. Investing in peace building, even when there is no visible violence, simply makes sense. And we do have some incredible stories from the past year of resilience built on long-standing investments in peace building. And I'll just give you one example from the Great Lakes, where despite COVID border closures, women petty traders across the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda borders were able to use their networks and relationships forged through our social cohesion project to advocate for changes that allowed them to continue trading and bringing income for their families. I also want to end on a positive note for Africa by highlighting that Senegal and Kenya are among the top 10 most improved countries over 5 years. We're not under any illusions that a lot of work remains to be done to ensure the upwards trajectory continues, but for now, it's something that we can celebrate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cindy. Very powerful remarks. And I can't stress enough a couple of things that you said. Fragility is contagious. Conflict is contagious. We know that. And it doesn't respect any borders. With COVID, you made some excellent points about how some countries were actually doing, okay because of social cohesion, or the ability to be able to stop disinformation and pull together, as opposed to countries like the United States who had all the resources and the ability to, to fight the pandemic. And we're going to see that change with the vaccine because now social cohesion, those countries who have access to the vaccine are obviously doing better. And you also raised climate change. And this is a really key part of this in terms of how we start thinking about climate change, as some people call it, a threat multiplier, and look at adaptation and mitigation. So thank you. Next, Neelan is going to talk about the US and really try to take what we saw, again, the data behind the story, looking at what does the Fragile State Index say about the United States and worsening conflict dynamics here.
Liz, thank you so much. And thank you so much for inviting me here. For context, for those who don't know me, the Bridging Divides Initiative is a nonpartisan research initiative, works to track and prevent political violence in the United States. I'm one of the co-directors, and I'm exceedingly grateful to be here today. And as Liz said, I'll focus on the US. So FSI's data indicates two important things about the United States. The first is that the United States does not top the list as a fragile state. And the second is that the United States is one of the world's most worsened countries, according to the index. So both of these are important as we think about what is happening, our proximate and longer term trends, and also what we can do about it. In the which do you want first, the bad news or the good news? I like to always start with the bad news first, so I will today. The world is faced with a global pandemic in 2020, and we all took a hit, but the US worsened in about half of the FSI indicators, while others didn't fare comparatively as badly. So why did we get weaker in the face of a shock? And why, especially when we are in so many ways stronger comparatively? The context is important in this, and I'll mention three things. First is that political violence is not new in the United States, and it's wrong to think that we went from zero to insurrection out of nowhere. The second is, while there's been overall stability in the United States and in the international system with the United States as a leader since about World War II, there's also been growing inequality, and it's been exacerbated by global recession in 2007, 2008. And an unequal recovery subsequently, with real economic grievances and real racial and social injustice to Black and Brown Americans. So the third is that we've had some proximate drops in trust in the fundamentals of our democratic system, in government, in the security sector, in elections, in media, and in each other. So today, only about 20% of adults trust government to do the right thing, according to a Pew poll. Sorry, it was in 2020 in the United States. And in terms of each other, 57% of our own people think that political polarization has gotten so extreme that we're in a cold civil war, according to the Edelman Trust Barometer. So we're increasingly sorted into like-minded groups. We have information bubbles. The polarization has proven to work for, depending on your definition of that, for political parties as a campaign strategy. And within this context, in 2020, we tracked mobilizers. So these are similar in a sense to what Nate referred to as shocks, but importantly, mobilizers are not to be equated with bad, but rather issues around which there is political passion. So in 2020, the election, COVID, and a national reckoning with racial and social injustice were our three major mobilizers in that order, where just under 50% of mobilization in the United States was around racial inequality. So COVID is bad, but I would argue that an election and addressing longstanding injustice is in fact good. Nonetheless, none of these mobilizers are what you would call resolved. So we're making strides on COVID, but there's vaccine hesitation. There's a continuation of the global pandemic, and the long-term economic, social, and opportunity effects of COVID are yet realized. 32% of, as we're moved to elections, 32% of the Republican voters, registered Republican voters, say that elections are free and fair as of January 2021. So 32%, that's a very low percentage, think that elections are free and fair. There are ongoing protests and demonstrations around fraud even to this day. and continued audits of the elections. On the left, there are real concerns about voter suppression that also delegitimize an election. And then finally, around racial reconciliation, trust in police is, for the first time since Gallup has been tracking it 27 years ago, below 50%. And we see a backlash against demonstrations that are themselves against systemic racism, with the highest number of armed actors mobilizing around Black Lives Matter protests in the United States. So the bad news is that we have a lot to deal with, and we're arguably in a worse place than we were before the shocks of 2020, and that's the bad news. But the good news is that the United States is not fragile. It is not a fragile state. It's not caught in Collier's fragility trap, and it demonstrated in 2020 and in 2021 exactly how much resilience it has to draw upon. So what does this mean for how we respond now? For me, we must choose resilience. We have to address both the triggers and the underlying causes. We need to build trust in the elections ahead of 2022 with bipartisan election integrity infrastructure. We have to address deficits of trust in the police force. We have to manage a global pandemic and invest in a more distributed recovery. But in addition to that, the United States doesn't live or act alone. And many of the inequalities and trust deficits that I described for the US exist around the world. And so we need global action. I will pause there.
So thank you, Neelan. Some good news and some bad news. I think as the US moves forward with the vaccine rollout, things are starting to go back to normal. So I do want to pull something, though, that Nate said earlier about the fact that you get through something and you think you go back to the status quo, but the next time a shock hits, you're less resilient. So you see this kind of chipping away. And we saw that within 2007 in the financial crisis, and now with COVID. And again, the US is very lucky because we produce things well, we worked on the vaccine, we're able to mobilize to get it out. But what do you think in terms of moving forward in the next shock or the resiliency piece of it?
Should I answer now or wait for the discussion at the end?
How about if you answer, do you mind answering now? Just because I'd like you to pull that out a little bit, or sure. If you want, we can stop and pause and go on, but
Yeah, I mean, a bit like conflict, resilience is something that's not quite a straight line. And one of the things that's heartening about what Nate said, I thought, is that in some cases, actually, shocks, you can come out stronger. So it is not given that a shock puts you in a worse place, but it is the case that that the election was not a turning point for the United States, and that we, I think, still are playing many of the playbooks of the 2020 issues into the future. So I would anticipate, for example, an ongoing continued conversation about Stop the Steal. I think that there are real group grievances and political factions that are documented in FSI that are absolutely still in play. And so in a sense, that is a double down call to action on the resilience side. We have not gotten through the risk period, and therefore we should not build to yesterday's need of resilience, but rather to tomorrow's.
So thank you, Neelan. I think you're right on. We have a new president, but we don't have a new country, and there's a lot of work there to do. So thank you for your comments. Maria Lal, can you bring us back to Africa? Talk a little bit about COVID-19 and the pandemic from the African Development Bank's perspective, some of the pressures you're seeing on countries, specifically around human security, and talk a little bit about the tool that to strengthen analytic capacities that the bank is putting together.
Thank you very much, Liz, and thank you to the Fund for Peace for this kind invitation. It's a real pleasure to join a panel of distinguished, I believe there are only ladies, is that correct? On the panel. And it's really a pleasure to join this conversation and to be able to talk about really what we can all do, what we do individually with regards to really long-lasting recoveries from conflict, from natural disaster, but also health crises like the current COVID-19 pandemic. And this is, of course, in very complex context. And hopefully we can draw some good conclusion to inform peace positive programming for results. I think we've heard that some countries, I think I heard Burkina Faso, Mali, Chad, some of the countries which seem to have fared not so well again in this index. But I think it's important to remind ourselves that unfortunately the dire humanitarian situation, persisting insecurity, lack of inclusive development in several parts of the African continent, whether you move from Sahel to the Lake Chad Basin, to the Horn of Africa, to Central African region, and even new hotspots such as the northern part of Mozambique. All of these are really exacerbated by the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. And indeed, we are dealing with countries which were already severely affected by a triple climate, humanitarian, and security shock. But if we talk only about, for example, the Sahelian countries, and as the Director General for West Africa, I have 3 of the 5 Sahel countries, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso. And these countries are now facing the additional economic, social, and health challenges of the COVID-19. And we know that the economic and human costs for the region are really unprecedented. The bank estimates that in terms of growth, we have declined from about 3.4% in 2019 to negative 2.1%. And there is also, it has been mentioned, significant risk of reversal of the gains that were made in the recent years in terms of poverty reduction, in terms of improved social indicators, and with a possible collapse of mainly informal economic activities and a lot of job losses in the private sector. Already we know that, for example, 9.8 million people need immediate food assistance in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. This is really a direct impact. We have seen, of course, the pressure on the public health system, and this, unfortunately, is here to stay with us, but this also gives us an opportunity maybe for some of us to redirect the type of assistance that we have given so far. And we think that the many African countries are also having to deal with high level of debts today. And this really has significantly reduced their fiscal room of maneuver. And yet this is at a time when the needs are great. We still need to test, but of course we still need, more importantly, we need to start vaccinating more people. We have also seen that the security situation, the humanitarian expenditure have had to increase at the same time. And if you take again 3 governments like Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, they are already forced to allocate between 18 and 20% of their budget to the security sector. And this is, of course, to the detriment of social sector, such as health. So there really needs special attention to be paid in these particular countries. And as I said, it is not surprising that unfortunately, these are some of the countries that are still having challenge breaking from the fragility trap. And we think that we need holistic responses, we need strengthened partnership, and we also need clear theories of change for enhanced peace-building dividend. I would like to maybe briefly mention some of the initiatives that the bank has done in response to the crisis and some of the things that we believe we can still do, and maybe highlighting what changes from the way we have been working. Immediately when the crisis started, the bank was able to put together a crisis response of about $10 billion US. It was approved last year, and our focus was really to provide very crucial help to cushion both the health impact, the socio-economic impact, and of course, the fiscal repercussion of the pandemic. We had a specific attention to, of course, the vulnerable population and the provision of social safety net, but we were also interested in preserving jobs. So we had a specific part of our packages which went towards the private sector and ensuring that they would be able to maintain the jobs. In addition to this targeted assistance program, which are really, we are also working on the institutional capacity building. We have technical assistance and financial support also to help consolidate the peace across the continent. It's important for us to continue to build resilient institutions. And for example, on the governance sector, we were very happy to see that along with the provision of very rapid response for the COVID, we had an opportunity to move a little bit the cursor on the governance institution, the control of the use of the resources, and we saw some good story on that front. But it's also important to improve the lives of the vulnerable population and to lay the foundation for sustainable and inclusive growth. So we are here today for the launch of the FSI, and we find this tool particularly important because it helps the world truly understand the different pressures that are faced by the country and that impact their development trajectory. And it's a tool that is grounded in science and it provides a measurable framework. And we really like that. With the 12 indicators that it has, it looks at several dimensions, and which are, we think, to a large extent, areas where countries with inadequate governance systems and capacity can fall in the fragility trap. And we are very pleased to note that the bank, the African Development Bank, own what we call Country Resilience and Fragility Assessment, the CRFA indicator. It has very strong parallel with the FSI. And as a matter of fact, the Fund for Peace helped the bank design that instrument, and you will not be surprised that there are indeed a lot of parallels. And we are using this instrument really to help us because we analyze not only the pressure points, but it is also important for us to look at those resilience points, which help us to better target our assistance. We are interested in building and enhancing this resilience area where we think that we can make the most difference to help countries move out of the fragility trap. What is going to be new for us? We are going to work more on the prevention of conflict. And we can come after, but we feel that it is better to prevent the conflict. And the CRFA, just as the FSI, give us a good entry point about some of the pressure points where you have a lot of risk of conflict arising. We think that it's also important to build community resilience and to address regional fragility. It has been said the fragility knows, unfortunately, no border, just as conflict, insecurity. So it's important for us to work on regional fragility, border towns in many countries. I mentioned it, the private sector is key, and it is possible to do to work with the private sector even in fragile countries. And we still believe that it's important to coordinate better the nexus humanitarian, peace and development. This is something that is going to change for us in our strategy going forward. More specifically, and I think it has been mentioned, we are still having challenges in terms of climate, and at a time when there are already so many other challenges. And we think that this is why at the One Planet Summit for Biodiversity early this year, the bank pledged about $6.5 billion to accelerate the implementation of Africa's Great Green Wall. As you know, the Great Green Wall is a $33 billion global program to combat desertification, drought, climate change, loss of biodiversity, poverty, food insecurity in the Sahel region. And we really look forward to working with other partners to make sure that we can create some green growth corridors. And this is by restoring, by developing, and also by sustainably managing more than 100 million acres of degraded land. And this is basically from Dakar all the way to Djibouti. So we are really quite excited about that. And we are going to channel our pledge through various complementary programs. And let me just mention one of such programs, which is the Desert to Power initiative, which aims to generate up to 10 gigawatts of new solar energy so that 250 million people can have access to clean energy. And in that initiative alone, we intend to invest about $2 billion by 2025. So overall, we see that the challenges are really multifaceted, and we are committing here to continue to innovate, to leverage data as the FSI that gives us valuable data today, but also our field experience so that we can have a better understanding of the issues and we can more effectively support our member countries through tailored solutions to break free from the fragility trap. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
So thank you, Mariela. And you and Cindy echoed a lot of the same points. The regional, your focus is on regional, as Cindy talked about. Conflicts are contagious and they're not confined within a border, and really that holistic approach. And again, you know, FSI, the Fragile State Index, you can look right across that and see all those different grievances and, as you said, pressures from a holistic perspective. I also just want to mention, you both, you know, really obviously touched on and talked about COVID. What is critical with this launch is this is one of the first times we're getting a comprehensive look at how COVID has impacted fragility and conflict. And so this is why it's so critical. We haven't had this window into this data. We've had, you know, people have talked about it. We've seen some examples, some anecdotes, but this is why this index is so key, because this is our new baseline, you know, and we think things are just going to go back to normal, but this is our new baseline. And with that, Natalie, I want to turn it over to you, because I want you to, you know, show globally more how this is impacting, and, you know, pull out some of the issues that the speakers talked about.
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how events cascade and how that's how the Fragile States Index can tell that story, as you were talking about earlier. So my colleague Nate has already touched on how shocks or pressures that are poorly managed can reduce future capacity. But the mirror image of that is that success in managing shocks and pressures can also enhance capacity to manage future crises and can create opportunities to address structural issues. So the FSI illustrates the dual ways this dynamic can and has operated in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And while it is called the Fragile States Index, I actually want to start with an example of a country that has demonstrated remarkable but largely unheralded resilience, Timor-Leste, also known as East Timor. So Timor-Leste is a fairly young country, having only secured full and formal independence in 2002, and it faced numerous early challenges. 10 years ago, it was ranked 23rd on the 2011 FSI and seemed at risk of getting stuck in that fragility trap that so many of our speakers have touched on. This year, however, it's improved to 52nd and was the most improved year on year between last year's index and this year's. And the reason why is, despite a tumultuous political situation at the beginning of the year, all the political parties in Timor-Leste Parliament came together in March to unanimously grant the government the emergency powers it needed to manage the pandemic. And while that unanimity did eventually break down, the government's management, together with bottom-up solidarity and mutual aid from Timorese citizens, helped the country prevent any confirmed deaths from COVID-19 in 2020, despite sharing a border with the country that has had the 17th highest number of deaths over the course of the year. What's more, this success has helped the political system, which is widely rated as one of the most democratic in the region, move towards taking on structural challenges, most notably the country's heavy reliance on oil export revenues. Now, the other side of this dynamic, where shortcomings in managing challenges can constrain capacity to address future challenges, can be seen in Eastern Europe. Quite a few of the countries there had been experiencing increasing popular discontent in the past several years, which is perhaps most clearly exemplified by the protests in Romania, which began in January 2017 and were still mobilizing tens of thousands of people more than 2.5 years later. Or you can look at Belarus, where protesters are still in the streets trying to uphold the apparent defeat of longtime President Alexander Lukashenko in the May 2020 elections. This popular discontent contributed to a failure to effectively manage the pandemic. As of when I last checked the data yesterday, Eastern European countries made up the top 7 countries in terms of confirmed COVID-19 deaths per capita, led by Hungary. And these failures to manage the pandemic will in turn have cascading effects in the future that will make it more difficult to manage the next crisis. One of these cascading effects is people leaving the country. When we looked at the FSI data that we prepared this year, I was surprised to find that Eastern European countries actually had the 6th largest indicators in the human flight indicator. 6th largest increases in the human flight indicator. So people are leaving those countries and bringing their skills and expertise to new homes, which will make it more difficult to manage the next crisis. However, these cascading impacts also affect countries that are blessed with greater wealth and technical expertise. So Neelan's already touched upon the fragility present in the United States, but I want to touch briefly on Western Europe. In Spain, Catalonia's independence referendum in 2017 created a bit of a crisis in state legitimacy and opened up an opportunity for the insurgent populist right party Vox to become the 3rd largest party in the Spanish legislature. A minority coalition government then struggled with the pandemic this year. By early December, more than 1 of every 1,000 Spaniards had died, the 4th highest rate in the world at the time, and Vox appeared to be only gaining in strength. Similarly, in France, which had been rocked by the Yellow Vest protest movement before the pandemic, and has had a mortality rate only slightly below that of Spain's, Marine Le Pen, leader of the ethno-nationalist National Rally Party, has led many of the recent polls for the 2020 presidential elections. In Germany, by contrast, Angela Merkel has led a response in which decisions to lift or tighten lockdown measures have been based on clearly communicated epidemiological thresholds, and she's been helped by this by a more successful trend in state legitimacy that you can see charted in the FSI over the last few years. This approach has helped to keep the mortality rate of Germany far below its nearby peers, and in part due to this success, the anti-immigrant AfD party, which had become the 3rd largest party in the German parliament prior, has experienced significant setbacks in recent state elections, including just 2 months ago in Baden-Württemberg, the home state of one of the AfD's co-leaders. Furthermore, talk of the 2020 general elections, which a few years ago would have absolutely required seriously considering the AfD, is now widely focused on Merkel's CDU-CSU coalition and the Greens. Now, if there's something to take away from the way the pandemic has played out across these various countries, it's that decisions made in the past constrain our options in the present, and so too will our choices in the present shape the course of the future. If we opt to pursue short-term gain at the cost of undercutting long-term capacity, that will come due in the future, perhaps in the middle of the inevitable next crisis.
So thank you, Natalie. I love that you started with the positive and that Timor-Leste actually did really well. There was a time when, it was the international community was pouring in there in terms of trying to stop the conflict and have free and fair elections. You also noted about Eastern Europe and the pandemic. And I think Nate talked about this as well in terms of that shock. It's a global shock. We don't see that this often. I mean, every 15 years, this was a global shock. So it's interesting to see you pulling in Eastern Europe. Spain was one of the most worsened as well. There's some of the comments that are coming in looking at Croatia and the UK. That wasn't all COVID though. So what are some of the other, looking at, we always tend to look at Africa, for example, but looking at Western democracies, what beyond COVID is pushing? What are those pressures that you're seeing from the index?
Sure. So for this year, I think the primary pressures in addition to COVID are a lot of the immediate effects of the pandemic. So you have things like the sharp economic contraction, which in many countries was actually sharper than during the 2008-2009 financial crisis. And of course, the disruption in delivering public services as a result of trying to manage the pandemic. But I think the key thing is the changes that these countries have seen before this year. If you look back over the past 5 to 10 years. So the UK, for example, which you brought up, has seen many of the same trends, particularly in the group grievance and factionalized elites indicators that the US has seen. And of course, there have been plenty of parallels drawn between those two countries. But similarly, France, as I mentioned, has the Yellow Vest movement, and Spain, the crisis in Catalonia, where I think there's just again, paralleling many of the trends that Neelan talked about with regards to the US, I think there's just some disruption in sort of the relationship between the government or the trust between the government and the people that makes it harder to be able to effectively manage a crisis when one comes as it has this year.
Okay, thank you. Another question that I get sometimes about the Fragile State Index is, for the past 16 years, you've been putting it out, and one of the key parts that makes it so good is it's consistent. It's consistent data that you're measuring. But we also know things are changing in the world with climate change coming online, more technology. How do you then pull that into the indicators to make sure that it's still consistent data, but adapting?
Sure. So our philosophy is that, for something like climate change or something like the varying effects that technology has on society, whether you're processing political issues of the day on, Twitter or the town square, that obviously has an impact. And of course, so does climate change, increasingly more and more so every year. But the importance of these phenomena are in the impacts. And we feel that the fragile states framework, as it has existed, since we created it, really does an effective job of capturing those impacts. So we're not measuring CO2 emissions, say, but we are measuring within the demographic pressures indicator the amount of arable land or fresh water that's available to a country, or the impact of natural disasters. So we don't have a climate change indicator or a technology indicator, but we do feel like the impact of these long-term processes are captured within our existing framework.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to open it up to all the panelists, and let's have a bit of a discussion. We know that we have some research from Pinker and others that say the world's getting safer. Violence is going down, but we also know, as Nate pointed out, that a lot of that data is based on indicators getting better in terms of poverty and child mortality rates. We know a lot of that data was based on interstate conflicts and battle deaths, and it doesn't account for violent extremism, coupled with conflict has moved internal. It's much more regional within a country. So how do people feel about that? In terms of, is the world getting safer? It doesn't feel that way, and especially after this year. So I'd like to hear from the panelists on that.
I can give it a go.
Thanks, Cindy.
I think that, as we've all alluded to, there's a story behind all data sets that we need to look into carefully. So on a macro level, things might seem to be going in another direction, but when you really analyze a specific context, it's quite different. And that's why in the peace building context, we're so big on context, conflict analysis, and really getting down into the details. So even when you look at something like, say, poverty is reduced massively, well, for who is getting less poor? Is it the people that have the most grievances and have the most incentive to take up arms, or is it a different group of people? And if you only focus on one aspect of the data, then you miss out a lot of the other things that might be going on. And which is why this index is so good, because it doesn't just focus on simple numbers like poverty rates or numbers of people killed, but it looks at a broad range of economic, social, political factors. And also, I think that we not only need to look at the data sets, but look at specifically who the stakeholders are to understand the trends of conflict. If I take the example of women, peace, and security in the Sahel, the dominant narrative is kind of that, you know, when we look at women in this context, it's a question of GBV and how do we protect the victims and so on. But we've actually done some research recently which shows quite clearly a proactive role that women play in perpetuating the violence, and that somewhat counterintuitively, they sometimes find that Islamic systems of governance provide them with more freedom than the secular state. So in order to make, well, I won't even say conclusions, but in order to analyze the trends, we do need to take each context and delve into the details and understand the stakeholders, understand what are the dividing points, understand what are the connecting points in order to be able to say, okay, things are generally improving or generally getting worse. I don't think we can just look at macro sets of data to come to those conclusions.
All right, thank you, Cindy. Anyone else want to jump in here? Or there's lots of questions in the chat that I'd like to get to as well.
So I think one way to account for, I guess, the difference between how it seems that the world is perhaps getting less safe and some of the data that we have access to is, to me, there's sort of two phenomena going on. One is that the avenues of fragility are changing a little bit. So, you know, you talk about this a little bit with a shift from sort of interstate conflict to intrastate conflict. And I think that's one of the most important, but certainly not the only one. And I think the other thing is that, you know, perhaps a few years ago or a number of years ago, there was, it seemed like countries were to some degree bifurcating into two classes. So there were those that were stuck in the fragility trap that Nate referenced, and seemed to be sort of stuck there indefinitely. And then there were countries that, I guess for lack of a better term, seemed to have made it. You know, they were stable, growing, successful, and to some degree it seemed like, you know, that was the two sets of countries were sort of stuck where they had gotten. And I think what we've seen in more recent years is that that's not true anymore. And that whilst the world countries are still stuck in that fragility trap, obviously some are able to bring themselves out of it. While at the same time, you know, aspects of fragility have affected increasingly those countries that perhaps were thought of as, you know, immune or stable countries in the past.
So thanks, Natalie. A couple of questions just pulling in from the chat. Neelan, one is directed at you in terms of the shock specifically to the US, referencing 9/11, referencing the economic crisis, and now COVID. So looking at that resiliency and how has the US been able to bounce back, and or are we not? I mean, I think that's really what the question is trying to get to.
Yeah, so I want to thank Ragad for this question, and I was thinking about it just now. And resilience, a little bit like conflict, doesn't have a straight arrow answer for you. So are we better or worse? There are so many variables there, and I think as Cindy really rightly pointed out, you can have some of the variables and not all of those variables, and which ones are going to play out more or less is not predestined ahead of time. So so who's going to get the mild case of COVID? Who's going to get the mild case of fragility versus the more extensive it's not straightforward. But having said that, in 2001, we had come through a pretty tough bout of political polarization in the 1990s, but actually in the early 2000s, possibly because of the kind of shock that 9/11 was, there was some political kind of pulling together, a lot of concern about the Iraq War, but nonetheless support for George Bush in the early days of his presidency. So the politically polarized, not clear. We do today, I think, face a much higher, a much tougher media space with a lot more mis and disinformation, information bubbles. I do feel like we are more politically polarized now than we were then. And then, of course, after 9/11, there was the economic shocks that Liz just referenced. All of these are kind of like, they kind of weigh on the country. But the other thing that I have found is that they also have created their own infrastructure, and they've created their own calls to action. So in the last election, the role that the media played in calling the election, even when political candidates were not willing to do that, that is civil society bringing a kind of resilience to the fore in that moment. And there were a number of organizations, and we sort of tracked 6,000 of them across the United States. Track is too extensive. We've mapped 6,000 groups that are working on conflict prevention, democracy, political polarization, a set of things that are relevant to this topic. So there's just a huge amount of energy to try to address these issues. So I am a person who is unwilling to make a call. Are we not going to come out of this, or are we going to come out of this? I think there are a lot of variables, but I do think that we have to decide to face a different direction. And I do think that we have to invest in that resilience for that to be the most powerful and palpable of the variables.
Thank you, Neil. And I think that's absolutely right. We can't make the call, but I don't want to bet that things are just going to get better. So again, I think the Fragile State Index really being able to quantify that worsening of social cohesion and being one of the most worst in terms of going up or down on the index is really critical for us to be able to push for those resources and the programs that are needed in the US. A really interesting question came in, and I'd like to hear what people think about this. The risk of the geopolitical interests and the increasing influence on the state of affairs for developing countries. And I would say not increasing, because during the Cold War, we were just fighting conflicts all over the world in other people's countries. But you're looking at the U.S., the arms sales. How does this impact the Fragile State Index? I'm just going to say it. You don't have to look any further than Israel and Palestine right now. So I'd like to hear the panelists' answers on that.
To answer perhaps narrowly the question of how it is captured within the Fragile States Index, so we do have an indicator labeled external intervention, which I think does try to capture the impact of other countries trying to influence the internal goings-on of a state, whether that's militarily or economically or through some other means. And to actually hark back to a previous question that you asked me, I think this is one of the impacts that sort of technological changes in recent years have had, is it perhaps lowers the barriers to a state attempting to exercise that kind of influence. So I think we've seen that particularly through attempts to influence the course of elections in quite a few countries. Obviously the US, that got quite a number of headlines in recent years, but it's certainly not limited to the US at all. And not limited to the country that is doing that is certainly not limited to only one or two in the world. So I think external intervention is becoming a lot more varied, and I think we try to capture it in all its forms within the index.
Okay, so thank you. We have a couple of more minutes, so I want to ask if there's anything else the panelists wanted to say, or based on the conversation that we've had, wanted to add something. And before we do that, I actually want to say one quick thing. The story behind the data is, I noticed catching on a lot. I want to make sure I give credit where credit is due. My incredible colleague from One Earth Future Foundation, Connor Seil, that's his talking point. And we used it a lot when we were putting together the metrics around for the Global Fragility Act for a selection of priority countries. So I just want to make sure I give a shout out to him. Okay, so I'm going to turn it back over to the panelists. Is there anything that you want to say that we didn't get to that you just think is really critical? Come on, Neil and Cindy, I know you got something.
I would just say that we really need to heed all the warning signs that are contained in this data and in the stories behind the data. And like I said, prevention is key. And when you look at these trends in detail, there are a few things that would probably keep us up long at night. And if I think of a country like Mozambique, which I think Congressman McCaul referenced, it doesn't appear in the top 20, but when you look at the trends, it's quite disturbing. And when you look at the known conflict factors, natural resource management, unequal development, climate change effects, etc. And when you look at how things have gone, where there's been similar issues in countries like Nigeria and Mali, if we wait to act on this, we are going to be stuck in another quagmire for the next 10, 20, 30 years. So I think that there's existing conflicts that we should be worrying about and addressing, but we also need to be looking at some of these red flags and taking appropriate action and learning from the mistakes of the past.
Cindy, I couldn't agree with you more. Prevention, prevention, prevention. And it's hard because there's so many things happening in the world that it gets pushed aside, but it's critical. Anyone else?
Yes,
Marie? Yeah,
Liz, maybe to pick up from where Cindy left off, I think I agree that it's something that we have to look carefully. You know, we used to be able to classify a country and say, for example, in Africa, we have 20 or 22 or 25 fragile countries. But what we are noticing now is that, and I think I mentioned northern Mozambique as one example, is that we are now faced with a situation where many countries have actually pockets of fragility within their setup. And this is a new development for us, which means that, for example, the CRFA is not an instrument that we will use only on those countries that are clearly identified, but we are mainstreaming to all countries. Another new development that we are very careful about is, of course, the externalities and the regional spillovers. It's something that we are becoming very concerned about. We have, and usually it is the terrorist attack that fuel that, and it's something that worries, especially many governments in West Africa. So we are looking at those elements as well, and carefully designing ways to make sure that we work far more on social cohesion, so that we don't find easy ground to promote these bad actors. Thank you.
Yeah, Neelan?
I really want to thank Marie and Cindy and Natalie. This is a really amazing panel to have been part of. And I feel like maybe the best thing that I can say right now is what they said, that I echo that. Because I think some really powerful things were drawn out in this conversation, and I want to jump on the prevention bandwagon that we have put out there in two different ways. One is that I'm quite certain that I'm preaching to the choir of the 100 people here, but by the very fact of your being here, certainly. But I would just say that this index gives us an opportunity for a call to action.
Right.
And that the tools that we have available and the efficacy of those tools is infinitely greater in its preventive state than in the midst of a crisis. Having said that, as has been said a number of times today, a crisis is a moment of change. And while in so many ways you're at your least resilient in that moment, you have the greatest fear, you have the least amount of clear information, you also have an opportunity, a window where things as they had been before do not continue to stand. And if you build that infrastructure ahead of time and you have the leadership ready in that moment, you can use that as a catalytic shift, as a turning point. But to do that, my experience through 2020 in the United States is that it does not just happen. It's not a sort of out of nowhere moment that either violence happens or the turning away from that. But that it's actually the long, hard work, undervalued in some ways, certainly underseen, that happens in moments like this where we see patterns and try to address them without all of the great fanfare of the crisis, so that when a moment comes, it can be that turning point. So I do want to thank the Fragile States Index again as my parting shot.
Thank you, Neelan. You said it really, really well. A call to action, I would say an urgent call to action. Conflict and violence, it's contagious, as the panelists have said. It destroys development gains. People die. The humanitarian, more than 80 million people today are displaced. So the consequences are here and now. So this is a really urgent call to action. We do have a conflict problem globally. And the Fragile State Index does a phenomenal job of capturing that. And it's up to us. There's some questions in the chat, like how can we make sure the indicators? It's up to each and all of us. When you are designing programs, when you're talking to policymakers, to use the data. Use the data. I'll just keep saying that. So thank you again for the Fragile State Index, for this invaluable tool. Please keep it open on your computer and use it every day. Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it back over to Patty.
Thanks so much, Liz. Hi, everybody. I'm Patricia Taft-Nasri. I am the Acting Executive Director of Fund for Peace, and I'd like to close this event by thanking each of our panelists, again, Cindy, Neelan, Marie-Laure, and Natalie for their time and expertise. Your contributions have been so insightful, and certainly helping us in framing and contextualizing this year's FSI findings. We're also extremely grateful to Senator Coons and Representative McCaul for their remarks and for their continued leadership on the Global Fragility Act. And I'd also like to thank their respective professional staff members on the Hill who were most generous with their time, given how busy we know that they are. Again, I'd like to thank Alliance for Peacebuilding, AFP, and our wonderful moderator, Liz Hume. As both Nate and George mentioned, AFP is a fantastic, inclusive community for those involved in peacebuilding and development, and basically anybody working in this space. So definitely encourage you to check them out. They're a wonderful, supportive organization for all of us. And last but certainly not least, I want to acknowledge with great thanks our partners at International Alert. FFP and Alert have spent many years working together in the field, particularly in Nigeria and West Africa, but this time we got to collaborate with their headquarters staff and their executive leadership as well, and we couldn't have asked for a better partner. Thank you especially to Julian, Barney, Nassim, and Livy. We really couldn't have done it without you. Want to also acknowledge the hard work of all of my Fund for Peace colleagues, especially Nate Haken and Natalie Fiertz, who've worked tirelessly on the compilation of this index, the articles, which you can find on our websites, and this launch today. And of course, our board chairman, George, who you heard from kicking off the event, and our board, all of Fund for Peace's board members who have been an invaluable source of wisdom and support, not just for the FSI, but across all of our programs. So thank you very much. Finally, in closing, I did want to let you all know that FFP currently has another index in production that we're anticipating launching a little bit later this year. And I think it's quite relevant given the discussion. This is an index of resilience that's being supported by the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, which we hope will provide Another useful way to understand how countries at both the national level as well as the local level are able to absorb and adapt and transform in the face of some of the threats and shocks and pressures that we've talked about a lot here today. And as most of the panelists have mentioned and in the opening remarks, we talk about prevention a lot, and understanding, identifying and investing in resilience at the local level and the national level is one of the best ways to prevent state fragility. So please stay tuned to our website and to our social media for the announcement of the release of the Resilience Index later this year. And thank you all again so much for attending today's event, for your thoughtful questions and remarks, and for your support of FFP's work. We hope to see you all again soon, and have a good day. Bye-bye.